Today, we'll be classifying quadrilaterals based on their attributes. So we kind of did this yesterday, but today we're going to put it on a huge Venn diagram. So here's our ginormous Venn diagram. Let's think about all the shapes we want to include and what they are. So let's start out super easy. We know that we want to include square, and we know that that has 4 right angles and parallel sides. Okay, we also want to include rectangle. Oh, we need to note that those are also congruent. Remember, congruent means equal. A rectangle has 4 right angles and 2 sets parallel sides. We also want to include a parallelogram, which just has 2 sets of parallel sides. You do not have to write this all to the side of your paper. You can just follow along and be thinking with me. We also want to include a rhombus, which has 4 congruent sides, and they are 2 sets parallel. We also want to include a trapezoid, which has, that has at least 1 set parallel sides. Looks good, looks good. And we don't have to include quadrilateral because it already is. All right, so the way we're going to do a Venn diagram is you can do this 2 different ways. You can either look for the most specific one, or you can look for the one that is the least specific. I think we should start with least specific. So think about these. This one has to have congruent parallel sides. This one has to have parallel sides. This one has to have 2 sets parallel sides, 2 sets parallel sides. What's different is this trapezoid only needs 1 set of parallel sides. So your trapezoid is going to be what's in the largest circle. Your trapezoid is what is in the largest circle. And we also want to draw some trapezoids. So I might say this line and this line are parallel, and this one are not. I might say this line and this line are parallel, but those 2 are not. I could say this line and this line are parallel, but those are not. Draw a couple examples of a trapezoid on your paper inside your trapezoid area. They should have at least 1 set of parallel sides. Good. Let's see if we can find the next most specific one. So if we're looking through, we can see that a rhombus has to have 4 congruent and 2 set parallel. Parallelogram is 2 set parallel, and all of these have to have right angles. So our next one that's least specific is that parallelogram. Parallelogram is our next least specific. So let's go ahead and write our parallelogram in here. And make sure you have 2 parallel sides, 2 sets parallel sides. And draw some examples of a parallelogram. You could say these 2 sides are parallel and these 2 sides are parallel. There's a parallelogram. I could do one shorter and say these 2 sides are parallel. These 2 sides are parallel. It's a parallelogram. Looks good, looks good. Now we have to think. I've got a rhombus, 4 congruent, 2 set parallel. And I've got a rectangle, 4 right angles and 2 set parallel. We are going to put rectangle over here and rhombus over here. And the reason we're doing this is because not every rhombus is a rectangle, and not every rectangle is a rhombus, but both of these are always parallelograms and trapezoids. I'll show you how to read it in just a second. But we know our rhombus has to have 4 congruent sides, 2 sets of parallel lines. So we've got this side, and this side. That doesn't quite look. Let's erase that one and try that one again. Let's draw a rhombus. That's better. Good. And then a rectangle. You know what a rectangle looks like. I'm going to put my right angles in my rectangle. to remind myself that rectangles have to have right angles. And then the most specific, the smallest part of your little Venn diagram here is a square, because a square is everything. A square is a rhombus, a square is a rectangle, a square is a parallelogram, and a square is a trapezoid. Go ahead and draw yourself a square in your box. Make sure to include those right angle drawings. All right, now that we know what it looks like, let's talk about how to read it. We know that the very middle is the most specific thing. So this square is a rhombus because it has 4 congruent sides. This square is also a rectangle because it has 2 sets of parallel lines and right angles. This square is also a parallelogram because it has 2 sets of parallel sides. This square is also a trapezoid because it has at least 1 set of parallel sides. If we move to rectangle, we know that a rectangle is a parallelogram and it's a trapezoid, but it's not a rhombus. If we move over to rhombus, we know that a rhombus is a parallelogram and it is a trapezoid, but it's not a rectangle. That's how you read that kind of diagram. Let's zoom out just a little bit and take a look at some of these questions. Now, these questions we're going to answer with always, sometimes, or never. Always, sometimes, or never. So let's take a look at this first one. A rhombus is blank a square. Always, sometimes, or never. What do you think? I hope you said sometimes. Sometimes. A rhombus is sometimes a square because you can have a rhombus that has 4 right angles, then it could be a square. It's also because it overlaps here in our Venn diagram. A trapezoid is blank a parallelogram. A trapezoid is blank a parallelogram. For this one, I hope you chose sometimes, because a trapezoid can have 2 sets of parallel sides, so it's sometimes a parallelogram. Number 3, a square is blank a rhombus. A square is blank a rhombus. I hope you said always. A square is always an example of a rhombus because a square is in the middle between rhombus and rectangle. That square has to have 4 sets of congruent sides before it's considered a square, and that's the definition of a rhombus. So a square is always a rhombus. A parallelogram is blank a rectangle. A parallelogram is blank a rectangle. I hope you said sometimes. A parallelogram can be a rectangle, but it doesn't have to be a rectangle. And last but not least, we've got a rhombus is blank a parallelogram. A rhombus is blank a parallelogram. For this one, I hope you said always. That rhombus is inside the parallelogram circle. A rhombus has to have 2 sets of parallel sides, so it is a parallelogram by definition. Make sure you have the correct shapes written in the correct areas and the correct sometimes, always written in as well. You can go ahead and get started on your IXLs and your classwork.